China 64. But again, just to kind of provide this global perspective on how the Philippines fares vis-a-vis other labor-sending countries. If the Philippines is amongst the world's top remittance-earning countries, the global scale of Philippine migration is unmatched. Philippine migrant workers can be found throughout the world. As of 2013, we still haven't seen the National Statistics Office really release the most recent statistics. But you see at least almost 3 million Filipino men and women left the Philippines, and this is for the first time in 2013. That's about, as Marco said earlier, 5,000 people every day. Filipinos were either newly deployed or rehired to work in nearly 200 countries and territories. 200 countries and territories. Literally, this is kind of a joke amongst Philippine migration scholars, that we had an atlas of the world and we threw a dart at it. Wherever it lands, you're going to find a Filipino, at least one. And this is really no exaggeration, because truly Filipinos are workers for the world. In terms of the top 10 destinations for Filipino workers, Saudi Arabia tops the list. The United Arab Emirates, 2, Singapore, Hong Kong, Qatar, Kuwait, Taiwan, Malaysia, Bahrain, and Italy. I mean, you probably noticed here that this is primarily in the Middle East and Asia, with the exception of Italy, of course. It's important to note that Filipinos are working mainly on a temporary basis in all of these countries, or exclusively, in fact, in all of these countries. But of course, they're also migrating to traditional immigration countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, Australia, and of course, things are shifting pretty rapidly here in Canada. But of course, they were also coming here as immigrants, but also now more and more as temporary workers as well. In terms of the top occupational types, just so you can get a sense of what's happening when it comes to Philippine labor migration. The top 10 occupations for Filipino workers are household service workers, nurses, so professional nurses, waiters, bartenders, and related workers, wiremen and electrical workers, char workers, cleaners, and related workers, laborers, helpers, general, plumbers and pipe fitters, caregivers, caretakers, welders, flame cutters, cooks, and related workers. So what do we notice about this? I mean, several things. One, these are kind of gender-segregated sorts of occupations. These are very low status, kind of low-wage occupations. You see in a multiple settings, from households to factories to restaurants and hotels. So what explains this? How do we understand the scope and scale of Philippine migration? So as I discussed in my book, which is going to be the topic of today, I attribute the globalization of Filipino labor to what I call the Philippine labor brokerage state. In this book, and in fact in this discussion, I will be focusing on the policies and politics of emigration as opposed to immigration. And I think this is a crucial shift for all of us, whether we're kind of scholars of migration, trade unionists, community organizers who are concerned with immigrant workers' rights or migrant workers' rights. I think oftentimes our focus is mainly on kind of the country of destination. What's happening in terms of immigration policy in the places where we live and work? And yet really, we can't fully address the issues of migration if we're not also paying attention to the politics of immigration. And as we will see, as I proceed with the talk, you'll see what some of the impacts ultimately can be for workers. But we need to focus on what's happening on the Philippine side, I think all across the board. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. So just a kind of overview of the talk. First, I'm going to discuss just why. Well, why does the Philippines broker labor? From my view, labor brokerage is a neoliberal economic and political strategy on the part of the Philippine state. After I talk about just the why, I'll talk about the how. Just what are the mechanisms by which this actually happens. So I'll look at the transnational institutional apparatus through which the Philippine government mobilizes its citizens and sends them abroad to work for employers throughout the world. I'm also going to talk about some of the ideological practices that the Philippine government actually engages in to kind of almost make out-migration kind of normal or commonsensical in the Philippines. And this is really crucial, I think, for those of us who live in North America, and we're here in a college setting. So of course you have people who come here to the university to kind of fill dreams about, or aspirations about what they wanted to be when they grew up, right? You ask that of all young children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And college may figure in that. In the Philippines, that's not the question. The question isn't sort of what do you want to be when you grow up, it's where do you want to be when you grow up. And I think that's a crucial shift in how people think about and imagine their futures. And so I look at the way in which the Philippine government has shaped even how people aspire or imagine their future selves in the Philippines. Then I'll also look at kind of the impacts on Filipino migrant workers. Of course, I'm not a Canadian scholar, but I can speak quite a bit actually, about what temporary forms of migration looks like and the impacts in the US, because we're seeing this shift as well in terms of the expansion of temporary employment schemes as well in the United States. I don't know that that gets much attention either there or here, but we'll look at some of that. And also, we'll talk about migrant activism, and specifically, I can speak to the possibility for scholar-activist collaboration, and I have quite a bit of experiences in that I would love to be able to share here as well. So let's just begin. Why? Why does the Philippines broker labor? Well, the beginnings of the labor export policy are in 1974. Some of you may recognize this man. Who is he? Filipinos in the audience. President Ferdinand Marcos, who was what? He was a dictator. He was a dictator. It was by executive order, actually. So it was an executive order when he actually introduced what we now call LEP, or the Labor Export Policy, in 1974. So why? Ultimately, overseas employment of Filipinos was what meant that the Philippines could be guaranteed a source of foreign currency on one hand, and on the other hand, that it could absorb un- and underemployment, as well as political unrest. So, well, let's just kind of talk about the context in which this is happening. Now, in the late 1960s to the early 1970s, the Philippines, like so many other third world countries, shifted from an import substitution industrialization to export-oriented industrialization, or EOI. So EOI left the Philippines struggling with balance of payment requirements and rising unemployment. By 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law to impose both economic and political discipline on the country. And a short 2 years later, with Presidential Decree 442, President Marcos instituted the Labor Export Program. And its aim really was to, I'm sorry, I knew it was going to do that. I'm trying to look at my notes and I'm having a difficult time maneuvering. Let's see. If you can just give me a moment, I'm sorry. Oh, there. No, I don't think it's going to let me, but that's fine. So, by 1972, the Philippine President Marcos had declared martial law, and the whole idea was to impose a kind of discipline on Philippine society. And this was sort of a requirement by what was called, this was sort of in compliance with what was at that time called the Washington Consensus. And I think some of you are sort of familiar with what this kind of consensus looked like. And so the aim of Marcos in introducing the labor export program was really to be able to produce foreign currency to address some of these balance of payment requirements, as well as to absorb un- and underemployment. Now, in the 1980s, post-Marcos and into the early 21st century, but in the 1980s, immediately post-Marcos, the Philippines introduced numerous structural adjustment policies. And that is policies that were meant to ensure that the Philippine government would continue to prioritize its debt repayment. Right? So it had amassed a kind of tremendous amount of debt in the 60s and 70s due to its developmental orientation of this export-oriented industrialization. And it had to really continue to prioritize debt repayment to major financial institutions. And so not only did it have to allocate a great portion of its budget to debt servicing, but also it had to continue to make the Philippines business-friendly, but not necessarily worker-friendly. And this would ultimately produce multiple forms of social displacement, from unemployment to underemployment to landlessness. And then into the 1990s and the early 20th century, what we've seen is an aggressive implementation of neoliberal reforms on the part of successive Philippine governments. You really see the beginning of this kind of with Fidel Ramos, President Fidel Ramos, and his whole Philippines 2000 vision, which really kind of, and I see some giggling here, I think a lot of us who were concerned about these neoliberal economic reforms were very concerned about the fallout from Philippines 2000, and that continued, of course, these really aggressive neoliberal policies under Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, President Estrada Arroyo, and now today with the second Aquino. And it continues to produce, neoliberal reforms continue to produce social dislocations. It hasn't really addressed the question of Philippine indebtedness. There continues to be a need for foreign exchange, and employment has become incredibly precarious. And I think for those of you in the audience who are trade unionists, you're probably well familiar with what happens when a government imposes neoliberal reforms. And one of the neoliberal reforms specifically, as it's impacted the labor market, is the contractualization of labor. That's one of the big issues in the Philippines, is the way in which labor has completely been contractualized. Didn't want any of its trade secrets to be shared with its competitors. And initially, this interviewee, didn't think very seriously about this. He thought that, well, I'll work for Starbucks. Upon the conclusion of this contract, I'll go ahead and try to find another job at another coffee house. But then when one of his coworkers actually found herself the defendant in a lawsuit by Starbucks, he realized this is a very real thing. Contractualization is very real. These provisions in the contracts will be enforced. And so he found himself at this point where he couldn't find other employment in the Philippines, and ended up seeking work as a barista in Saudi Arabia. And this is sort of a concrete example of the ways in which at least labor flexibilization or contractualization impacts the Philippines. How neoliberal reform produces just precarious forms of employment. And it's interesting because even Philippine government officials will say this themselves. In one of the interviews I did with a government official in one of the big migration bureaucracies, he says to me, quote, "Economic growth alone doesn't equal jobs. Globalization does not always result in the same kinds of jobs because of contractualization and flexibilization." So even by their own admission, Philippine government officials who work in the migration bureaucracies recognize that there is very little opportunity for employment in the Philippines. It's very precarious. And so they see themselves as participating in this, in being able to place Filipinos for employment, but elsewhere. But I mean, again, it just speaks to kind of how neoliberal economic reform has these kinds of impacts. And we could talk about kind of the other sets of impacts, but I wanted to focus more specifically just on employment. There are other sets of kind of consequences, for example. Clearly, overseas employment or labor brokerage generates employment for Filipinos, but remittances perform another set of economic and political functions. What happens is migrants' remittances, when they come back to their families, come to pay for basic things like food, clothing, school, and health care. Well, what does that suggest to us? Again, it suggests to us that something is happening in terms of neoliberal reform in the Philippines. neoliberal reform isn't just about labor market flexibilization or contractualization. It's also about privatization. So increasingly, social services come with a cost that Filipinos cannot bear without sending a family member abroad. And so this is another kind of economic function of remittances, is that it basically provides for incomes for families to be able to pay for services that the state no longer provides. And I think another kind of aspect of this neoliberal strategy of the Philippine state is that actually, you know, there's a way in which kind of ideologically it can kind of, and the Philippine government is very good about representing the export of people in very positive ways. And one of the things that Philippine government officials will say is that, you know, this is kind of a nationalist policy. You know, we don't have to depend anymore on foreign investors all the time, or non-Filipinos to come in and kind of invest in our people. We do it ourselves. And of course, you know, that sounds kind of fine and good, and that can actually kind of really appeal to people's sense of nationalism, that it is they themselves that are participating in kind of the economic and political development of their country. But what it also does, it absolves the state of the kinds of responsibilities and accountabilities that it has to its citizens. But there's a way in which this kind of functions also, that's also very quite problematic. So now, how does the Philippine government actually broker labor? How does it actually work? There are a couple different pieces to kind of the brokerage of labor. The first is that it's comprised of transnational institutional apparatus. So there's an actual kind of what I kind of call a bureaucratic assembly line. There's literally a bureaucratic assembly line that commodifies and mobilizes Filipinos for global employment. The other set of aspects of the labor brokerage apparatus is not just this kind of institutional apparatus. It's also discursive or ideological practices. And these are kind of the ideas about migration that the Philippine government produces to normalize that migration, to make it commonsensical even, to make it such that it is the question to be asked for young people is not what are you going to be when you grow up, but where are you going to be when you grow up? And so one of the things that the Philippine state tries to do is tries to shape migrants' connections to the Philippines when they're abroad. So on one hand, the Philippine government tries to make it very normal to leave, but at the same time, the Philippine government will also try to make it very normal for people to state their connections. Because migrant labor brokerage requires that, right? It requires people to imagine themselves leaving while also imagining themselves connected. And so I look at those processes, and we have to pay attention to that, because there are ways in which you know, I think especially as activists, I think there are a lot of activists in the audience, you know, as we pay attention to how the Philippine state attempts to make its appeals, and in what ways are these appeals really meant to sustain labor brokerage, and in what ways are they actually, you know, appeals that are really going to kind of address Filipino migrant workers' rights. And so I think we need to have that critical perspective on these discourses. So what are the institutions of labor brokerage? There are many. The Philippines has a vast transnational migration bureaucracy through which it facilitates out-migration. So there are several key agencies that are behind this. One is the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, or the POEA. I mean, it's so interesting. You know, if you ever go to the city of Manila or Quezon City or kind of Metro Manila, any of you who may travel to the Philippines, the significance of these migration institutions is so clear just in the way that public transportation is organized. I mean, literally, the POEA is a stop for major forms of public transportation. Because, of course, many people are going to this place to be processed for out-migration. Another major institution in this migration bureaucracy is the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, or TESDA. There's also the International Labor Affairs Service. And this is kind of interesting because it's actually part of the Philippines Department of Labor and Employment. So the Department of Labor and Employment, of course, is dealing with labor and employment issues domestically in the Philippines, but it actually has this International Labor Affairs Service of labor attaches outside of the Philippines doing the work of helping to facilitate migration. And I'll talk a little bit more about what these agencies do in a bit. Then, of course, there's the Department of Foreign Affairs. And the Department of Foreign Affairs is basically the department that oversees the Philippines consulates and embassies. So even the consulate and embassy, the embassies and consulates are also very much a part of this transnational migration bureaucracy. Just to give you some historical perspective, we have to realize that when Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos introduced the export of labor, it wasn't as if he introduced a policy just sort of out of nowhere. And there are some major historical precedents for the out-migration of Filipinos. And that really can be rooted in the colonial labor system instituted by the United States when the U.S. colonized the Philippines in 1898. And it's really under the colonial system, and specifically the colonial labor system, that you see some of the historical precursors for what is now labor brokerage. So one of the major things that was instituted under the United States when the U.S. colonized the Philippines in 1898 was a so-called policy of benevolent assimilation. So basically, the United States thought of itself as a kinder, gentler empire. In fact, the U.S. doesn't think of itself as an empire. And one of the policies that the U.S. kind of instituted to distinguish itself from the Philippines' prior colonial masters, the Spanish, was this policy of benevolent assimilation, which basically established American-style public education in the United States. So basically, public education was established in the United States. The medium of instruction, of course, was English under this policy. You see that already kind of primes Filipinos for kind of at least initially U.S. labor markets. You also see under the U.S. colonialism in the Philippines the beginnings of the migration industry. For those of you who have some familiarity with Asian immigration to the United States, the Philippine migration was preceded by first Chinese immigration, which was then met with really anti-immigrant nativist fervor, which led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then the U.S. turned to Japan for labor, then they were also met with anti-immigrant nativist fervor, which led to the exclusion of Japanese. And then, growers and other industries, kind of the agriculture and other industries, kind of still seeking out labor, then went to the Philippines, which became a very convenient source of labor because it was a colony. So basically, Filipinos were no longer, as a colony, considered foreigners. They were actually considered colonial subjects and kind of nationals, so therefore they could come into the United States much more easily. And it's in that process that this migration industry starts to develop. And then you also see kind of, even after colonial rule formally ended in 1946, the continuation of bilateral labor agreements between the Philippines and the United States that form the kind of early architecture of what I call labor brokerage. So you kind of really have to situate what's happening in the Philippines today in this kind of longer historical context. So what are the functions of all of these agencies? It's really four things, which is authorization, training, marketing, and bilateralism. So, going back to the question, what explains, how do we have Filipinos working in nearly every country around the world? It really comes back to some of these institutions and their functions. So authorization simply means this, that the Philippines migration agencies actually do this work of studying immigration policy, conforming to this paperwork. We wouldn't see the same kind of exit You know, there's really kind of this way in which the Philippines kind of, that's why I call it a bureaucratic assembly line, because they're literally assembling people by making the papers very, very easy just making it much easier for people to get through the process. Now, of course, from a Filipino's perspective, it's never fast enough. I mean, when you need to leave the country because you have a family to feed, it's never fast enough, even if it's a matter of weeks. But for those of us who actually understand or ever experience what it actually feels like to apply for a visa, for instance, there may be some international students here in Canada who have to go through the process of applying for visas, or any of you who've ever traveled internationally and you're not holding the special, you know, US or Canada passports that allow you virtual entry anywhere. Visa processing is incredibly tedious, but the Philippine state has made it incredibly efficient. Training. The Philippine government is not just identifying kind of what visas are available, but also to what extent those visas come attached with any kind of training and education requirements. So then the Philippine government's Technical Education and Skills Development Authority will actually create specialized programs that conform with these visa requirements. So many of you, of course, here are familiar with the LCP, right? What's the LCP? Right, the Live-In Caregiving Program. It should be, for those of you here. So the LCP, the Live-In Caregiver Program, many of you know, actually had very specific requirements actually of training that caregivers had to undergo before being able to come to Canada. And so the Philippine government made sure that these classes were available through the TESDA as one example. But there are many, many examples of kind of technical certificates that Filipinos can easily earn through this, through the TESDA. Marketing. Literally, the Philippine government has a marketing branch that goes on actual marketing missions around the world, where it actually meets with prospective employers and host governments to basically advertise the merits of hiring Filipino workers. Not very different from what Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo did, as I showed you in 2003 in the United States. This is just a sampling, so you can get a sense of kind of where the Philippine state goes. Australia, Bulgaria, Canada, Japan, Jordan, Korea, Kuwait, Lebanon, Qatar, Romania, Singapore, Taiwan, the United Arab Emirates. So you're seeing, of course, that these marketing missions are to some of the countries that form the top 10 destinations for Filipino workers, but also these are for quote-unquote new markets. So the Philippine government actually sends representatives to all of these delegations to all of these countries to basically promote the employment of Filipino workers. This is just a sampling of kind of the brochures that get produced. The very glossy brochures. You have this one, Filipino nurses, caring for the world, or the Filipino seafarer, taking the lead. This is just a sampling. There's also brochures for Filipino teachers and others. So it actually does the work of advertising workers. Perhaps more crucially, the Philippine government actually engages in bilateral labor agreements. And if you're paying attention, you might notice a flag that's very familiar to all of you on the table here. Yes, it's a Canadian flag, because in fact the Philippine government has engaged in bilateral agreements with not just the country of Canada, but in fact the provinces of, including British Columbia and Alberta. So the Philippine government has had a memorandum of understanding with the province of Alberta since at least 2008. So there is a way in which the Philippine government actually facilitates the migration of workers through these agreements that are both informal but also formal. Did you want to take a picture? Everybody started like I can even show you the memorandum of understanding between the province of Alberta and the Philippines if you like. I think I have a file here. So then as I talked before, there are also all of these discourses or ideologies of labor brokerage, right? Because ultimately, you can have all these institutions, but how do you mobilize the people to think themselves migrants? To think that this is what is expected of them, or that this is where they should be, that they should be aspiring elsewhere. So the first, kind of instance of the Philippine government kind of introducing a discourse around migration is this idea of balikbayan. or kind of loosely can be kind of translated as nation returnee. And so really, this was meant not necessarily to encourage people to migrate, but it was more meant to capture those who are already out of the country and reconnect them back in. Because again, as I said earlier, labor brokerage functions with both of those mechanisms, right? That people imagine themselves elsewhere, but when they're elsewhere, imagine themselves always forever connected to the homeland. So the balikbayan was initially kind of introduced in the 1970s as a way of capturing the Philippine overseas population. As overseas migration came to be all the more central to the Philippine economy, a new kind of discourse emerged, and that's this notion of the Philippines as the bagong bayani, or the new national hero. And so the idea was twofold. One, the idea was, okay, if you migrate, that's not a brain drain. That's not sort of something problematic for our country. If you migrate, you are a hero. You are engaging in this sacrifice, a sacrifice that might require your separation from your family, but a sacrifice that will contribute to the nation's progress. Right? That's the whole notion of the bagong bayani. But at the same time, bagong bayani isn't simply about encouraging people to think that migration is a good thing, that it's a contribution, but that even if you're abroad, you will always be a Filipino. And so the Philippines is always kind of, bagong bayani is probably the one kind of discourse that probably continues to be dominant in the ways in which the Philippine state refers to overseas Filipinos. They've tried other kind of things. So there was a time when President Arroyo actually tried to introduce this notion of the Filipino overseas as being the OFI, the overseas Filipino investor, right? As opposed to just being an overseas Filipino worker. But really, kind of the discourse that continues to be very dominant is this whole idea of the Filipino as the bagong bayani. And so some of these kind of discourses or ideologies are actually kind of captured in law. So one of the laws is what's called the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995. And then the second is the Republic Act 92, what did I do here? Oh, I guess it's Republic Act 9225 of 2003, which is basically the dual citizenship law. What's really just important here is that both of these laws kind of institutionalize these ideas about Filipinos as kind of migrants Filipinos as people who should migrate but should also continue to be moored back home and connected to home. So the first act, the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act, I mean, that actually was passed in the wake of the hanging of a Filipino domestic worker. Actually, we just recently, I think probably Migrante Canada also did something around commemorating the hanging of Flor Contemplacion on March 17th. So Flor Contemplacion was a domestic worker who was hanged by the Singaporean government. And this was in 1995. And that just generated a wave of protest from the Filipinos in the diaspora. And my nose is running. It's cold, I'm not accustomed to it. But basically, Flor Contemplacion was hanged by the Philippine government. She might as well have been. But hanged by the Singaporean government in 1995, and many in the Filipino community really believed that she had been set up. So basically, she was accused and tried and convicted of murder. She was convicted of murdering another Filipino domestic worker and supposedly the child that that woman took care of. But so many Filipinos believe that there was something incredibly off about the case, that she was probably set up by the other woman's employer, but that the Singaporean government was going to literally make her hang for it. And so Filipinos around the world, in the Philippines, in countries wherever they were working, really mobilized to demand that the Philippine government intervene and stop her execution. And some commentators actually say that the mobilization to protest the hanging of Contemplacion was rivaled and even maybe surpassed the protests against the dictatorship. This is the kind of outrage that this case elicited. So the Philippine government did very little to stop the execution, though of course, other accounts are out there. But from my view, they didn't do enough. But what they did do in the wake of the execution was to pass this law, the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act. And so on the surface, this act seems to promise the Filipino migrant workers a whole set of protections once they, prior to leaving and even when they're abroad. So when you look at the law, it basically says, Filipino workers can't leave the country unless their contract says that the wage that they're earning overseas will not go below the Philippine minimum wage or something. And these are sort of provisions in the law. Or it'll also say, it also says that Filipinos overseas are always Filipinos, and so therefore they deserve the right of representation. And so Philippine government officials, or specifically the embassies and consulate offices, are supposed to kind of advocate for Filipinos wherever they may be. So these are sort of aspects of this Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act. It's supposed to promise all sorts of rights and benefits for migrant workers. And so this was sort of the consolation that the Philippine government kind of presented to the Filipino people. We couldn't stop our execution, but we will protect you in these other ways. And so the question, of course, is, does it really? Is it really true that all of these kinds of mechanisms that are meant to protect workers, do they actually, in practice, work on behalf of workers? And one of the things I found during the course of my research on this topic is it isn't. Actually, it doesn't offer much. In fact, these ideas of nationalism and Philippine citizenship actually become a form of labor discipline. And I can talk a little bit more about this case. But in short, basically what happened was, in the early 2000s, nearly 700 Filipino overseas workers employed at garment factories producing clothing for Old Navy. I think you have Old Navies in Canada as well. The Gap and other major retailers. This law that I discussed earlier in 1995 is not the best law. The fact of the matter is that it wouldn't have come into existence had there not been kind of organized Filipino migrants around the world kind of demanding that the Philippine government do something about migration. And so, however limited that law is, it is an example of the possibilities that open up when migrants organize transnationally. And there have been really successful cases where migrants have been able to push for really major reforms of migration policy. Another thing that Filipino migrants have done is actually work cross-racially and cross-ethnically. Probably the most exciting example of this has taken place in Hong Kong amongst domestic workers. So Migrante, actually Filipino activists, active in Migrante, were actually also instrumental in forming what's called the Asian Migrants Coordinating Body, which is a cross-ethnic, cross-racial body of domestic workers. And they were really successful in being able to ensure that they've been able to ensure that domestic workers in Hong Kong have been afforded some rights, including kind of just protections from different sorts of fees and other kind of so fees that the Hong Kong government was trying to impose on foreign workers, and really kind of pressing for migrant rights there. There's been, Migrante members have also been really kind of instrumental in forming even more global alliances, including the formation of the International Migrants Alliance, which is an alliance of grassroots migrant organizations around the world. Again, this can't quite capture the scope of it, but I think it's kind of nice to see that workers, as globalized as they are, kind of as workers, they're also globalized as activists. This is some of protests in the Philippines. Now, just to end in terms of kind of collaborations, as Marco mentioned, I have been working very closely with the migrant community for many, many years. In fact, my research grew out of my work in immigrant rights organizing. I did the project precisely because of my work as an activist. And one of the most recent projects that I did was what's called the Caregiver Research Project. So So basically, in short, what we did, I and my former graduate student actually, we did a participatory action research project in collaboration with the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns, also Gabriela and some other kind of organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so basically what it was is that, you know, one of the Filipino community centers, the Filipino Community Center of San Francisco, had seen an increasing volume of undocumented caregivers, so people who were working to tend to the elderly in San Francisco. And a lot of them were dealing with all sorts of labor issues, from wage theft to just kind of basic kind of abuse from their employers, I'm sorry. And so they knew that it was going to be necessary for the migrants to kind of create their own organization to kind of articulate their needs and demands. And so we decided to collaborate on a research project whose aim, with the aim of not necessarily generating data, but really kind of creating the infrastructure for an organization. Because if you kind of understand kind of qualitative research methods are very kind of parallel to kind of the basic building blocks for organizing. So to do qualitative research, you need to kind of contact build. You need to kind of get to know people, gain their trust. Qualitative research, of course, we start to hear about people's life stories. Well, these are the sorts of things organizers do as well, but the aim is very different, of course. The aim is not to hear just people's stories for the purpose of simply understanding. It's to hear people's stories for understanding, to work with social change. And so basically, what we did is we used kind of elements of the theater of the oppressed, and basically taught the caregivers how to be interviewers. We talked about how do you approach people, where do you approach them. They helped generate questions about what might be relevant for caregivers. And so basically each of them committed, we started with a team of 12 workers with 12 allies. So the allies included professionals who would come in after work, to students, university students. So started with 24, we trained them over the course of 6 weeks. They had a graduation and then went on a massive kind of research campaign. At the end of the year, we basically were able to launch a new organization. We could talk more about the details of that, but basically as workers started talking to one another, sharing each other's stories, they recognized their shared experiences and the shared need to come together collectively. And so Migrante continues to this day as a very active organization, working around issues of wage theft, the living wage, and other issues in the city of San Francisco. So I'll just end there. I think I've gone rather long anyway, but thank you for keeping up with me. Oh yeah, I can sit? Yes. Good. I carry a little burden, but a 6-month so I'm kind of tired. I think I have to turn this on.